All right, this is exciting, isn't it?
Here we go, guys, in 5, 4, 3. Here we go.
It's time for Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive.
Thank you for good programming, and I appreciate the content and really enjoyed every moment.
It's a privilege to have you on your station and listen. It's good stuff. It's very educational.
It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Wow. Paul, when did they redo the Open? I'm not sure I can live up to that.
I know nothing about that. I just hit the intro button, and then that's what I got. So,
well, you know, if that's what's going to happen every time I go on vacation, I should go on vacation more often. That's quite the... That is quite the intro there that we have just shared with people. I have taken 2 weeks off. I am well rested, and I will do my darndest to live up to that very high bar we just set. Oh, hi. How you doing this Monday, January 6th? It would be nice after taking the holidays off to have some time to reflect and be philosophical and big picture-ish, but there's too much. We've got an hour. Yes, the phone lines are open, 773-763-9278. I still remember. I remember it. 773-763-9278. You can call us on that number. You can text us on that number. Man, there is a lot. There is a lot to cover, though. So let me just hit the ground running, shall I? First of all, today, January 6th. 4 years ago, this day unfolded very, very differently. I am completely convinced that what happened that day, the insurrection, was planned by Donald Trump. The only thing that didn't go according to his plan is he wanted to be there. As you know, he had a big fight with his Secret Service protection, and he threw a fit because they wouldn't drive him over to the Capitol building. They kept telling him it wasn't safe. And he kept saying that he didn't care, that he wanted to go anyway. And there is, according to Cassidy Hutchinson, who was told this story by a Secret Service person in the car, Trump actually reached over into the front seat and tried to grab the wheel of the vehicle to get the agent to take him to the Capitol instead of taking him to the White House. The Secret Service agent in question was never brought before the January 6th committee and never had to testify one way or the other under oath. But I can certainly see that happening. He wanted to be there. He wanted to orchestrate it. And how did things go that day? If you follow me on social media on Blue Sky, I have posted something that the January 6th committee put out. It is a 12-minute tape of raw sound from that day, as well as much of it is testimony that the committee got from people about that day. It runs over 12 minutes. You can find me, joanesposito.bsky.social. joanesposito.bsky.social. And I have a link to the entire 12 minutes, which you really should watch. I'm just going to share a small part of it. Benny Thompson, who was the congressperson in charge of this investigation, sets this up, sets up the 12-minute video, talks about what happened that day, it's real easy to forget not that day happened and what happened, but how awful it was, how terrifying it was. Not only for the people who were there, but for our country. The rioters, the insurrectionists, remember, got within 40 feet of where agents were hiding Mike Pence. The Secret Service agents with Mike Pence were calling their families to say goodbye in case the worst happened. In the wake of that insurrection, 5 Metropolitan and Capitol Police officers died. This is just it starts with Benny. It's a real short clip. It is not anywhere near the 12 minutes that I really want you to go back and revisit. But I want you to listen to this right now.
Some of the key evidence our investigation has uncovered.
There were officers on the ground. They were bleeding. They were throwing up. I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
That was Officer Fanone, who still is suffering from the injuries he received that day. President Joe Biden wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post today about January 6th. And was as positive as you would expect him to be. He says, in part, for much of our history, this proceeding, this certification of the election is what he's talking about. For much of our history, this proceeding was treated as pro forma, a routine act. But after what we all witnessed on January 6th, 2021, we know we can never again take it for granted. Violent insurrectionists attacked the Capitol, threatened the lives of elected officials, and assaulted brave law enforcement officers. We should be proud that our democracy withstood this assault, and we should be glad we will not see such a shameful attack again this year. But we should not forget. We must remember the wisdom of the adage that any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it. We cannot accept a repeat of what occurred 4 years ago. For those of you who still subscribe to the Washington Post, and honestly, I'm not sure how much longer I will be one of them, Joe Biden's opinion piece is on the opinion pages today. And indeed, our vice president did certify the election. Remember, that's what Mike Pence was there for. Basically, he had no power. It was just going to be somebody who says into the mic, like, so certified. But somehow Donald Trump got it into his head that if Mike Pence went up there and said, I refuse to certify, that somehow Trump would still be president. It was ridiculous. And while Mike Pence is not known for his bravery, he did do the right thing that day. He didn't want to. He consulted people to see if there was any legal that would allow him to do what Donald Trump wanted him to do. He called Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle, former vice president, told him, no, this isn't, you don't get it. You don't have any power. You're just there for ceremonial purposes. No, don't even think about it. You cannot do that. Today, our vice president, who lost in her efforts to prevent Donald Trump from returning to the White House, did her vice presidential duty. She certified the election. We have sound of that. Paul, go ahead and play that now.
The peaceful transfer of power is one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy. As much as any other principle, it is what distinguishes our system of government from monarchy or tyranny. Today at the United States Capitol, I will perform my constitutional duty as Vice President of the United States to certify the results of the 2024 election. This duty is a sacred obligation, one I will uphold, guided by love of country, loyalty to our Constitution, and my unwavering faith in the American people. As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile, and it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles and to make sure that in America, our government always remains of the people, by the people, and for the people. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
And that, my friends, is how you do it. That is how you promote the peaceful transfer of power. Jimmy Carter passed away while I was home for the holidays. We are going to talk about that, and we are going to start to take your calls when we come right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
It is Monday, January 6th, as we do every day. We have the phone lines and text lines open. Yes, I agree with the texter. We do owe Dan Quayle a real debt. He's the one who told Mike Pence, no, there's no way you can refuse to certify. You have no power today. You're basically there in a pro forma, ceremonial, powerless, rubber stamping capacity. And Mike Pence ended up doing his duty. Let's go to the phone lines. My first guest of 2025 is Jim from Chicago. Hey, Jim, how are you? Happy New Year.
Yeah, you too. Welcome back. Your voice sounds like a million. May it hold out as well as it sounds today. And I was going to say this over-the-hill con man has evaded justice. When we have the most incarcerated population on earth, we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. And the poor people that are in prison have no recourse once they get out. They have no way to make a living, even if they have the physical ability to do it, because their record will chase them until they die. And the other thing I was thinking about was the Parisians. I was thinking about the people in Paris. The average citizen there has cradle-to-grave health insurance. They have a free university. They have a free university, and they also $21. They imagine this $21 a week for 6 days a week child care. Now, Trump is contemplating a tax cut for people, Joan, I can assure you, that aren't even concerned about their bottom line. They're not like the average citizen. They go, oh, my God, my tax went up 100 or down. They have no idea. It doesn't affect their bottom line at all. And that's his first order of business, apparently. And then, unbelievably, letting these people out of prison, these lunatics out of prison. To what end, I have no idea. But it's just
let's hope
terrible.
He hasn't.
Yeah.
He hasn't talked about that for a while. It wouldn't surprise me if he does it. But the only thing I've seen him talk about is that he has multiple executive orders with tariffs ready to go. That's what I've seen him. And you know, Jim, Democrats, I hope more Democrats do this. Donald Trump made a lot of promises while he was on the campaign trail, as he always does. Now, you and I might say, well, he's a lying liar who lies, but a lot of people believed what he said. And there has been talk that Democrats are going to craft legislation to accomplish the things he promised. Bernie Sanders is already writing up a bill that would cap credit card interest rates at 10% because Donald Trump said that he was going to rein in these out-of-control interest rates. So Bernie Sanders said, you know, that's what he said. So clearly he's going to support this, so I've written it up. And there's talk that things like protecting Social Security and all this other hooey that he said while he was on the campaign trail, Democrats are going to create legislation to try to accomplish the things he promised and then sit back and wait and see, does he sign off on it or does he end up killing it? And then, if he kills it, it's just more ammunition for the midterms. So it's a win-win either way. Either we get some of these protections that he promised, or he walks away from his promises, and that's all going to be used against Republicans in the midterms. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, well, you have to have some strategy going ahead, but think about his wife. She's in some kind of a documentary trying to make more money. These people are the greediest family I've ever seen. They're talking about these people. I mean, all they think about is money, morning, noon, and night. And my problem is what he's changed his wardrobe, though, if you notice, Joe. I guess that was the politicking side of him, but with the red tie and the blue serge coat on. Now he's actually changed the outfit. He must be settling into the White House. But I don't trust. First of all, he thinks he's a genius, and I mean, anybody who thinks they're a genius is nuts, in my opinion. and what about, well, you're going to have to ask, I think you have the professor on later on today, what about the geopolitics, and what about Ukraine, the president of Ukraine, or Palestine, or these places where it's just mass murders going on, and he has no regard for human life. You could tell it was the pandemic hit that he had no regard for it.
Yep.
He was fully aware a month before he let on to us. He was aware of it a month before it broke out. Yeah. So,
and I'm terrified, Jim. I'm terrified. I've been reading a lot while I was off about bird flu.
Oh, yeah.
And people don't believe that it's going to be like COVID because it's much more difficult. Most of the people who have acquired bird flu were people who work on dairy farms or people who have repeated close contact with animals, because this one doesn't jump as easily. But the mortality is right now at 50%. 50% of the people who get bird flu die. COVID's mortality rate, by the way, is 1%. If we get a bird flu pandemic under Donald Trump, God help us all.
I know, but he's like a pandemic himself.
Yes,
in the flesh. But what, is this week? If this is every time, I mean, thank God he's over the hill now. But 8 years of how many pandemics can we stand, Joan? That's my point. Yeah. And my thing is, I absolutely seclusion. I can't listen to AP. I can't listen to these news outlets.
I was on except for the reading about bird flu, which is, I love reading about medicine. I was on a blackout. I really, truly put myself on an information blackout over the holidays. Once in a while, Ray would start to say something, and I'd be like, Ray? Oh, he goes, you're still on a blackout. Yes, Ray, I'm still on a blackout. Yeah, this morning, Jim, he started to talk about something. He goes, are you still on a blackout? I said, yes, it's not 2 o'clock yet. I'm still on a blackout.
No, I know exactly what you feel. That's exactly the way I am. I can't, it's just too much to believe. that how we were deserted by 10 or 12 million Democrats, that's the one that really kills me. I don't know what they decided. I have no idea, and I'll never know. But why 12 million? Because it looks like the solid number for Republicans is about 72 million. And the Democrats usually get, they usually get them by about 6-7 million. But this time, I don't know what happened. But anyway, we got 4 years.
The Democrats who stayed home. What was that? I don't care about the demographics of who voted or that. I want somebody to talk to the people who decided that voting just wasn't something they were interested in this time around, because it was more than enough to put us over the top.
Right. And they're registered, Joan, and that's what kills me. I mean, if you're going to pass, I can see if they were unregistered voters and just ignore it completely. But these people are involved enough to get registered. So that's just a mystery that we'll have to contend with over the next 4 years. But I mean, I'm glad you're back, Joan.
Thanks, Jim.
Sounds terrific. And you have a great show. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
We are going to take more calls and talk a little bit about Jimmy Carter after a break. And also, Jim mentioned that I was having the professor on today. Well, he's not exactly a professor, but he certainly could be one. In the 4 to 5 hour, Spencer Critchley is joining us. Remember, you may remember before the holidays, he's the author of Patriots of Two Nations, which is really the first book I read that explained to me the difference between a Trump supporter and, say, the rest of us. He is writing a new book, but rather than waiting until it's all finished and going through the whole editorial and publishing process, he is posting his new book chapter by chapter. These are the first drafts, and he has wanted feedback. And I told him that we were going to discuss this book as it is posted. There were 2 recent chapters posted. If you want to do some quick studying before 4 o'clock, you can find the chapters at dastardlycleverness.com. That's dastardlycleverness.com. He does a podcast called Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. And there's a website, dastardlycleverness.com. And Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 are there. We will be talking about those with Spencer Critchley in the 4 o'clock hour. We're going to take a break now. We're going to come back with more calls, and we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Hello, it is our first show of the new year. Happy 2025 to you, and thank you for all of the people on the text line who are welcoming me back and wishing me a happy new year. We are doing what we did in 2024. We're going to spend the first hour of the show talking about what's going on in the world and taking your calls. Of course, on Fridays, we do that for the entire first half of the show. But let's go to the phone lines right now. Steve is on the line from the Gold Coast. Hey, Steve. Happy 2025.
Yes, the same to you. And this is what a January 6th is supposed to look like in a civilized society.
It's supposed to be business as usual.
Exactly. When we lose, we don't like it. We can hem and haw about it, but, in the end, we accept it. I am somewhat troubled to hear a few voices in the background who are on our side, exclaiming this notion that, the Democrats need to find a way to keep him from taking office because, this is what post-Civil War, we had intended with regard to those who had served in the Confederacy. With all due respect, I agree. I don't want Donald Trump to take office, but he has not been convicted of those things. And we can't just simply say, we don't like it. So, and then what happens when the next Democrat is in that position? They haven't been convicted of anything, but they've been accused of a bunch of things. And so what? Republicans don't certify? So I'm sorry. I can't agree with that. We're the adults, and I think that we act like adults today. We acted like adults today. And also, I think you raised an interesting point with regard to those people who didn't vote. When looking at the exit polling and then also post-election polling, we find that they were in different camps. So there were the people who actually couldn't bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, but were disillusioned with the performance of Joe Biden. And part of that was based on the lack of positive messaging from the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign, and others simply what Donald Trump was advocating resonated with that. They actually believed that we were in some sort of a recession because they were getting their news from God knows where. They thought that Donald Trump was the alternative. So, I mean, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, but they couldn't bring themselves to support Harris and before that Biden. And, I mean, it says something about, you know, the need for investment in a society in terms of education and civics and so forth, and just understanding where you get your information from matters. And a lot of the sources that people rely on today are just God knows awful. And
amen to that.
Mainstream, and mainstream sort of media, as they like to call it, has been vilified to death. You know, that's the enemy. You know,
yeah. But you know what? I expected. Just like remember when Trump was in office the first time and the Washington Post debuted that banner, "Democracy dies in darkness," and they started recording the number of lies Trump told. I expect mainstream media, with the access that their journalists have, to be the strongest voice for democracy. And it really seemed, especially toward the end, that the Washington Post and certainly the New York Times, it's like they didn't want to offend anybody. And so they didn't really want to get into this whole icky business of our form of government and whether or not it was at risk. It was easier to just do Trump said this, Kamala said this. Trump said this, Kamala said this. And I do think the mainstream media has a lot to answer for. Even right now, I mean, did you see? I said I was on a news blackout, but I saw this on social media where the political cartoonist for the Washington Post quit because for the first time in like her 30-year career, an editor refused to run her cartoon because her cartoon showed a caricaturized version of Jeff Bezos and some other billionaires offering up sacks of money to Donald Trump, what appears to be a big Donald Trump statue. And her editor wouldn't let her run it. Now, some people say, well, you know, she should have known that if she was making fun of the guy who owns her publication, she'd get in trouble. But you know, her attitude was, getting in trouble is basically my job description, and I've been doing it for 30 years. And somebody said that it was a real mistake, aside from the fact that it was a mistake to spike that cartoon. It made it a bigger story. You know, I mean, She did this. She's like, look, I'm just an editorial cartoonist. I'm telling you why I'm quitting, what happened. I don't believe anybody's going to really care. I'm not super famous, and it isn't going to be a big deal. But I want you to know this is what happened, and this is why I am no longer going to be at the Washington Post. And that has been a huge story. Another embarrassing black eye.
Absolutely. I mean, there used to be a saying in journalism, you know, it's the job of journalists to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Right.
And that means go after people who are in power. But unfortunately, when, you know, you start to be acquired, when, you know, you get mergers and acquisitions and so forth, and you're just, you know, another line on a balance sheet, then the question is, okay, how do we run this media outlet? Well, okay, we don't want to offend anybody on this side. We don't want to offend anybody on that side. So that means that, you know, for everything that we publish that says something that's negative about Trump, we have to say something negative, or we have to say something positive about him, or we have to say something negative about the other side. That's not how journalism works.
No, it isn't.
You know,
and how about the owner of the LA Times? And I did end my subscription to that one, who recently said, you know, Trump's really controversial. Why don't we just go a month without like any editorials or any real news coverage of Trump? Let's just take a Trump breather. Like that's what? Does he not understand what their job is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I could share your disdain for where news has gone in terms of mainstream media. Now, the only thing that's worse than that is social media and other outlets such as that. So as bad as we want to perhaps critique ABC, that's owned by Disney, okay, that doesn't come close to Fox and Newsmax. And Fox and Newsmax are actually moderate relative to what you see on social media in terms of the crazy conspiracy theories that people buy into there. And that's what's unfortunately driving this country. There was a time when, basically people got their local news from their local newspapers, and then they tuned in to the world news and other sources, PBS and so forth. And that's where they got their ideas about what was going on. And then on Sundays, there were the Sunday morning shows. People still tuned into those, but not as much. And, we were all on the same page, no matter where you were, in terms of what your favorite show or channel was. But today, I mean, you're living in parallel universes. Over here, right, people are telling you what's going on in the adult world, where there's reputable journalists and scholars and researchers. And then over here, you have insane people who are telling you the equivalent of flat Earth theory about what governs this country. And you cannot have a functional democracy as long as we're living in those parallel universes.
Right. Steve, thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you.
It is always a pleasure to chat with you. And I wish you a very good 2025.
You as well, Joan.
Thanks. Let's go back to the phone lines. Cynthia is on the line from Denver, Colorado. Hey, Cynthia, how are you?
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Listen, I guess I would really respect anyone, and especially the Democrats, and especially Kamala today. What would be wrong with her saying, I am so upset about this election. 4 years ago, we had an insurrection, and the transition of power now is the right way. What's wrong with them acknowledging people's frustrations and disgust and still mentioning the correct way to do things? This walking up, it's traumatizing, Joan, for me. Mm-hmm. For people and the Democrats to act as if nothing happened and business as usual, sure. But say to me, I'm angry, I'm upset, sad, I'm depressed, I'm this, I'm that. However, we must move forward.
Sometimes I think, Cynthia, when Democrats think that they're taking the high road, it comes off as kind of passionless. Like, you're absolutely right. I mean, Kamala Harris could have said, 4 years ago, on this day, it was a nightmare. But today I'm going to show you how a responsible adult certifies an election. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we're petty, Cynthia, for wanting that. But at least acknowledge, when people take the high road without even acknowledging the bad behavior of someone else, I don't know. I think it plays into their hands. I really do.
It's called battered wife syndrome. Mm-hmm. I feel battered.
Yeah. He's a really nice guy when he's not drinking.
Yeah. I'm on a news blackout as well. I listen to your show, Patty, and Tom. That's it. I will not be until I hear someone say, and your previous caller was correct. Our country is severely ignorant when it comes to civics and how government works.
Yep.
And somehow I believe the Democrats could take advantage of that and educate us. I've been yelling that for years as they had merged some of the information of the past with the current. And so why don't I run for office? Because I'm tired. I'm
yeah, really.
And I didn't wake up politically until I was in my probably 40s. And so here we are. I just want to. I don't do petitions online anymore, except if it's animals or the planet. And I'm going to let things be as they may.
Yeah, I think that's what we all have to do. Cynthia, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but anybody who's listening, I'd like you to think of a word that is going to represent you for 2025. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. I've asked a few people, and it really seems to stump them. So you have some time to think about it. But after much thought, I've decided that my word for 2025 is abide. Abide. To remain, to continue, to stay. And then abiding, abided. To put up with, to tolerate, to endure, to sustain, to withstand without yielding or submitting. That's where I'm going in 2025. I'm going to endure. I'm going to sustain. I'm going to withstand without yielding or submitting. So, Cynthia, I want you to think about it and call me back later this week when you come up with your word, okay?
Okay.
Deal. We've got to take a break now. We will be right back with more after this. Oh, should we keep going? Okay. Paul has suggested that I should keep going. Well, I know what I want to do before I forget, and we are starting to run out of time. So callers, hang on. But I do want to share with you an acknowledgement of the fact that at the age of 100, Jimmy Carter passed over this holiday break. He said that he wanted to live long enough to vote for Kamala Harris. He did that. And people are looking back on his presidency. It was often considered that he became more popular for what he did post-presidency, you know, his work for Habitat for Humanity, that he became more well-known and better thought of in his later years. But people are looking back at his presidency. And I was really shocked because I was doing some reading about this. Politically, he may not have been the most brilliant strategist. Maybe he didn't know how to confront his enemies or get the better of them politically. But I was stunned at some of the legislation that was accomplished while he was president. Really, because, you know, I had that same idea. Well, you know, Jimmy Carter, a nice guy, but not a very good president. Go back and look at a list of his accomplishments, things that he got done. Plus, he was president back in the 70s. He had a sense then that we needed to address global warming. He was very interested in that, in making sure that, you know, he was the president who installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. Thank you, Ronald Reagan, who took them all down because, you know, whatever. But had Jimmy Carter persevered, had he been a little bit maybe more politically popular, where we would have been on global climate is we'd be in a lot better position than we are now. That's for darn sure. He accomplished a lot. There was a famous speech he gave where he says at the beginning of it, you can find the whole thing on YouTube. It's called the Crisis of Confidence speech. And he talks about, you know, I was going to sit down before you today. He was doing a presidential address from like the White House. And I was going to talk to you about the global climate situation and energy and our energy needs. But I realized, and this is my paraphrasing, of course, I realized that really there are bigger issues, that we have bigger fish to fry. And it has to do with our attitude and our feelings about this country and our belief in this country. And he took a small issue and extrapolated it to what it said about us, big picture. Nicole Wallace on MSNBC, I owe her a debt because she went through the whole Crisis of Confidence speech and she pulled out clips that she edited together. And I want to share that in just a second, but here's what I want you to listen to. This was in the 1970s. In the 1970s. And so much of what he said in that speech, it's like he could have written that speech and delivered it today. It is uncanny. This was roughly 50 years ago. And it is still where we are now and what we need to think about now. Again, this is Nicole Wallace on Deadline White House on MSNBC. Her producers took the whole crisis of confidence speech. It's, I don't know how, it runs like 12, 13 minutes. And they edited together some of the more significant comments he had to make. And again, he starts off by saying, you know, I was going to come here to talk to you about the energy crisis, but I realize that, A, I've talked to you about that before, and also there are more important things we need to address. And then he went on to make this speech, which, like I said, he could be making it today. Listen to Jimmy Carter.
I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. There is a growing disrespect for government and for churches and for schools, the news media, and other institutions. This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth, and it is a warning. Little by little, we can and we must rebuild our confidence. We can spend until we empty our treasuries, and we may summon all the wonders of science, but we can succeed only if we tap our greatest resources: America's people, America's values, and America's confidence.
That is just a portion of that speech. I strongly suggest you look it up on YouTube. There's all kinds of stuff on YouTube that you can find about Jimmy Carter. God. It's, in a way, it shows his insight. But in another way, I'm like, oh, my God, that was 50 years ago. And those words are still needed today, and they still resonate today. Kind of wish we could hear that and say, oh, yeah, oh, that was a long time ago. We're so much better than that now. Let's go to the phone lines. Ron is on the phone from Chicago. Hey, Ron, how are you?
Pretty good. Happy 2025.
To you, too.
Yes. Out of respect for the late President Carter, the flags were flying at half-mast, and Donald Trump is whining about this because he does not want this at his inauguration in 2 weeks.
He mentioned that. I saw a post. Oh, Democrats are so happy because all the flags are going to be flying at half-staff for my inauguration. And then he made some cryptic comment on his social media, something like, well, we'll just see about that, or I don't know. But President Biden has declared this Thursday, January 9th, as a day of mourning. So that means that not only is the entire Jimmy Carter funeral going to be carried on your radio and television shows, but that it's a federal holiday. So this Thursday, none of the banks will be open. I don't know what else will be affected. If you've got something that you need to do and that business is usually closed on a federal holiday, don't try to do it on Thursday, is all I'm saying. But yeah. Oh, and Donald Trump, people believed that he wouldn't show up. He says he's going to show up for the Jimmy Carter funeral.
Yeah,
can't wait for that.
After he said before that he was the second worst president in history, And last week, after the car bomb in Las Vegas.
You mean New Orleans? Oh, no, the one in front of the Trump Tower, yeah, the military guy who committed suicide, yeah.
Yeah, one thing was that he was a MAGA follower, and very little is mentioned about that. And also that Elon Musk was bragging that how well his Tesla cars are built because the car bomb didn't damage the hotel.
Yeah, the Cybertruck, hasn't it been officially recalled 6 times since it was first put on the market?
Probably, yeah. I don't drive.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the number I read recently. Plus, do you know anybody, except for maybe the people who buy it, and that sucker runs, I think it runs like $140,000, and yet every time I've seen one and anybody I know sees one, they make fun of it. It's so ridiculous. It's like there's even a song I heard on social media where this duet sang about, seeing a Cybertruck and knowing that the person who was driving it was like a moron. Ugh.
And and one more thing, it's been 4 years since the rioting at the Capitol building, and it has ruined my birthday forever.
Oh no! Is today your birthday?
Yes, it's my birthday.
Oh well, happy birthday, Ron.
Let's
put it this way, Ron. It has made your birthday memorable. How's that? Eric Zorn's birthday is today too, so. He was also complaining to me about the fact that his birthday was today and how it's never going to be remembered quite the same way. Well, happy birthday, Ron. And thank you so much for the call. Always a pleasure. Let's go to our good friend Dave, who's calling in from Hoffman Estates. Hello, Dave. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and you did wear your mask this time.
Some neighbors invited Ray and me over, and they said, well, my husband has a little bit of a cold, and I said to Ray, you go, I am not going. I am not going to spend another holiday in bed. So I was very careful.
Good. We're glad, like others have said, we're glad that you're back. And talking about the birthdays on January 6th, which is worse, having it on this one or having the birthday on Christmas Day?
Yeah. I have one of my cousins, his birthday is December 22nd, and he said he always hated it because his parents would give him a birthday present, and it would be wrapped in Christmas wrapping. So he knew they took one of his Christmas gifts and gave it to him for his birthday. He said he always hated that.
You just got done mentioning about with Trump whining about that, in his wrong term of calling it mast. It's staff, as you correctly pointed out. We're not a ship. And it happened before. Back when, like I mentioned to Patty, I think last week, that during the inauguration of Nixon's second inauguration, and they were lowered to half staff after the death of President Truman.
Oh, I didn't remember that.
Yeah, and they stayed lowered for another 30 days when LBJ died 2 days after Nixon's second inauguration. So he never whined about it because he knew that this is national protocol.
Yep.
Sleazy as he was and stuff. I mean, he was a former military guy and a senator and that. He knew what the protocol was and that. Yeah. But when, you mentioned on that with that cartoonist. I got to thinking, isn't the Washington Post kind of violating the cartoonist's First Amendment right?
Oh, well, the cartoonists, they have like their own, like, you know, journalists have various associations. Apparently editorial cartoonists do too. And the editorial cartoonist organization put out a scathing rebuke of the Washington Post for killing that cartoon that made fun of billionaires offering money to Donald Trump. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear when Patty talks to Scott Stannis, what he, if he has anything on that. But when you are talking about those two, might as well call them domestic terrorists. I don't care if they were former military in that. And the one is still active duty, just out on leave. The one outside of Trump's hotel and that.
Yeah.
Well, my former coworker and best friend, his son is a retiree of the Marine Corps of 20-some years, and he used to go with his son and that to the BX or PX and stuff in the commissary. Well, he said as of last Friday, I believe it was, after that bombing, he said it's closed off to any civilians now. Only former military, with proper ID and that. And I don't even know if their dependents can go. It's just got to be the military. But they stopped that.
Wow.
Right now.
Dave, thank you. We gotta get to the news. Thank you so very much. Thank you. And Eleanor from the South Suburbs texted in that she has a word, intrepidity, like being intrepid, intrepidity. The fact or quality of being resolutely fearless or dauntless, bold courage. Eleanor, I like your word of 2025. We're going to take a break for news. We're going to come back with much more after that.
Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now on WCPT 820.
Oh, sorry, Paul. You give me a couple weeks off, and I forget that when I want to talk, I have to turn my microphone on. I'm going on and on and on to apparently no one but the dog. Oh, well. Thank you for joining me this Monday, January 6th. I hope you are having a good 2025 so far. As I mentioned at the top of the show today, I have put myself on a news blackout. For the last 2 weeks, I have gone out of my way to not pay attention to what is going on in the world. So I am looking forward to our next guest, Jeffrey Korn, bringing me up to speed. He is the director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. He's an expert on what is going on in the Middle East. And welcome, Jeffrey. Happy 2025. I hope you're having a good year so far.
I hope you are as well, and thank you for having me back.
So while I was on my news blackout, did everything in the Middle East get solved? Is there now peace?
Well, I don't think there's now peace, but I think that over the last month, particularly as a result of the fall of the regime in Syria and the degradation of Hezbollah, the strategic balance of power has really radically shifted in favor of Israel versus Iran.
I was going to ask you, because I know that we've talked before about Hezbollah being supported by Iran and, Iran and Russia looking to Syria as their port access and an important country to them. Is Iran weaker? Is Iran regrouping? Because they did all what they did in the Middle East, they did it through proxies. Have they suffered themselves because of this?
Well, I think that it's important to emphasize the point you just made, that their principal direct threat to Israel over the past decade has been through the use of the proxies of the Hezbollah in the north, of
Hamas in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad operating out of the West Bank in Gaza. And all of that has been degraded. So their ability to project power into the borders of Israel has been significantly diluted. Now, I don't think that means they're in any way no longer a threat or defeated, and it may actually forebode more aggressive efforts on their part to be able to engage in long-range warfare and with the frightening possibility of a nuclear-armed missile, which I think the Israelis are very concerned about. We know that. And we're concerned about it as well, as should every state in the world and especially in the region. But there's no question that the fall of the regime in Syria and the speed with which the IDF essentially dismantled Hamas or Hezbollah's significant threat along their border has really been remarkable and a testament to the effectiveness of the Israeli intelligence community, precision targeting, and the capabilities of the IDF.
When I left to go on holiday break, Assad and his family had relocated to Russia, and it's the last I read, some of the current government officials were reaching out to those who had toppled the regime, and it was kind of like, hey, you know, we're not your enemy, we can all work together. How has that shaken out? Is there a new government, and what are their leanings?
Well, I mean, I'm getting out into an area that I would have, candidly, I would say I have limited expertise. I think we all recognize that there's a situation of uncertainty and to some extent chaos. You have a number of different actors that were involved in the opposition to the Assad regime that now have to figure things out, and that includes the Kurds, who are our principal ally. And let's not forget, we still have American troops on the ground in combat outposts in Syria that have been assisting in certain opposition efforts, particularly the Kurds. It's a very complicated issue with the Turks because historically the Turks have been seeing the Kurds as their principal enemy in the region. So here we are with an ally in Turkey, a NATO member, that sees the kind of breakdown of the central government in Syria. The Kurds are a major part of that success. They're concerned about what that means for them. We're in the middle of all this. And then on top of all this, you have the Israelis, I think, recognizing that the regime that fell had a lot of military capability that could be, if it falls into the wrong hands, a serious threat to their security. And that's why I think you've seen the Israelis conduct strikes into Syria against, for example, they attacked a naval base and sunk many of the Syrian naval ships, missile sites. They're trying to degrade the conventional military capability that the Russians had provided to Syria for many decades, so that if an unfriendly regime were to take over, they don't have a capability, or they have a degraded capability to threaten Israel. It's very complicated.
Do we have, I'm speaking of we as the United States, we do have this military base. Do we have influence politically in Syria?
I mean, you would hope so, but it's not clear. Everybody recognizes that the leader of the opposition coalition that toppled Assad and took over the central government, if you will, had been affiliated with a group that was designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States. He was not one of our favored proxies in that civil war. So somehow there has to be effort to interact with that individual. And then again, we have to see, again, I think an important factor is how the Kurds fit into this new coalition government, because there's a loyalty, I think, between the Kurds and the United States. They've supported our efforts both in Iraq against ISIS and in Syria. So how they fit into the equation, I think, is an important factor for the United States. I don't think anybody knows for sure the direction this new regime is going to go, what type of control they're going to have, whether or not Syria is going to continue to exist as a unified state or become more of a balkanized entity where you have different opposition groups essentially controlling different parts of the country. I think all of that is yet to be seen. Having said all that, I think it's better for the region that what has happened than allowing Assad to continue to act as a proxy for both Iran and as Russia's principal ally in the region.
When during some of our conversations about what was going on in Gaza, you and I both were concerned that the war would expand, grow past its borders, involving more countries. The war did expand, I guess, or at least there was a military action in Syria, but it doesn't seem to have, at least yet, snowballed into some kind of global conflict. Are you feeling better about the chances of that?
You know, several years ago, a group of retired American generals participated in a study that I was part of, trying to predict what the next war with Hezbollah would look like. And we had pretty dire predictions of the scale, the duration. And I think everybody that was involved in that and many security experts were really surprised how quickly and effectively the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli intelligence community was able to hobble, to a certain extent, Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is not gone. There's still a presence in Lebanon. But the major escalation that we actually predicted, we predicted a major ground war in southern Lebanon, did not come to fruition. And I think that is a consequence of a truism of military operations, that command and control is really the decisive point when you're fighting an enemy. If you can cut off the head of the snake, then it flops around. And that's what the Israelis did with the pager operation, with the walkie-talkies, with the, having the willingness to go deep into Beirut, into areas controlled by Hezbollah, and do precise targeting against Hezbollah leadership and command and control. It's clear that the foot soldiers, so to speak, weren't sure what to do, and that is what enabled the Israeli Defense Forces to push them out of southern Lebanon, back behind the Litani River, which, by the way, they were supposed to have never even been there under the UN resolution that Israel complied with when it withdrew from Lebanon in 2006. And the entire presence of Hezbollah since 2006 has been a blatant violation of UN Security Council resolution that nobody was willing to do anything about. And so it's a good reminder that the quality of intelligence and the ability to engage in precision targeting oftentimes can mitigate the necessity of major and long-lasting combat operations.
Interesting. So by cutting off the leadership and doing those strikes for the ships and the weapons caches, basically there was no bigger war because there was no ability to wage a bigger war?
Well, I think there was an ability, but there was no coordinated capability. You can have a lot of resources, but you need leadership to direct them, to coordinate them. And that's what the Israelis decimated early on. By the way, it's also an important illustration to listeners to help understand how military commanders make proportionality judgments in combat. Because when they do so, what they have to do is make a judgment of how many civilians that they know will be harmed by an attack are tolerable in order to achieve the outcome of the attack. And the more valuable the target, the more tolerance there will be for the infliction of civilian casualties. Now, there's no manual or book that a military lawyer or commander can look in that says, you know, if you're trying to kill a battalion commander, there's no algorithm. However, it does put in context for us much of the collateral damage that's been inflicted even in Gaza, because many of those airstrikes that caused that collateral damage were directed against Hamas command and control capabilities and personnel, which is why there's military logic, as tragic as it may sound, in the judgment that the price is worth the benefit, if you will. And that's a reality of the law of war that many people just don't understand.
Wow. We need to take a break. I'm talking to Jeffrey Korn, who's the director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. He's an expert on the Middle East. We're going to continue our discussion right after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Professor Jeffrey Korn is the director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. He's an expert on the rules of war, particularly as they apply to complex situations like the situation in the Middle East. I know that I'm asking you a little bit to speculate, and most of the people I interview are really hesitant to do that. But as best you can, how do you think our policies will change after Trump is inaugurated? I mean, he has very clearly during the campaign come out and said that he loves Benjamin Netanyahu, and basically, you know, whatever he wants to do is fine with Donald Trump, which doesn't necessarily, because he said it, doesn't necessarily mean he'll follow through on it. But they have had pretty much of a love affair for many, many years. So how will the United States position in the Middle East change, do you think?
Well, I mean, if history is prologue, we know that the last time President Trump was in office, the Israeli leadership did some things that they had been restrained from doing, the most notable being the annexation of the Golan Heights, which many international law experts, including me, thought violated international law, because the Golan Heights, there's no debate that it was occupied territory, and you can't, under international law, unilaterally change the status of occupied territory. I mean, that's what Putin did in Crimea. So, and the president moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I think we're getting signals of what this means already. There was a statement the other day by Netanyahu that if the hostages aren't released very soon, there's going to be a major increase in the intensity of operations in Gaza. I think that the Israeli political leadership has a perception that they're going to be much less constrained by concerns from U.S. policymakers. By the way, I don't think it's just President Trump. I think the Republican-controlled Congress is a major factor here, because remember, what the Israelis are most concerned about when we express concerns about their actions is the continued flow of defense resources. And I don't think they're going to be worried about that now. Now, maybe that will have a positive effect in the short term in pressuring Hamas, that's already on its knees, to finally come to terms with their obligation under international law to end this illegal detention of these poor hostages. But I think it also will have a spreading effect. And I think everybody's going to be watching Israeli policy vis-a-vis the West Bank. And the announcement that Mike Huckabee is going to be the ambassador to Israel, I think, is another signal. That's somebody who has always supported settlement activity. You're asking me to speculate. If I had to predict, and assuming that the right-wing coalition in Israel retains political power over the next couple of years, I think you will see an effort to annex portions of the West Bank into Israel proper.
What will be the international implications of that? I mean, even if the United States doesn't want to get involved, how will the rest of the world react to that?
Well, we know that the rest of the world considers the West Bank of the Jordan River to be occupied territory, and they will view any annexation as a escalation of the illegality they already believe is ongoing there. The settlement activity, it's a bit complicated, but if you believe that the West Bank is occupied, and I will concede that there are legal experts and certainly many Israelis and Americans who don't believe it's occupied territory, believe it's historic Jewish territory, Israeli territory, and that it was occupied by Jordan in 1948 during the War for Independence, and all the Israelis are doing is reclaiming their territory. But that's not the majority view. And if you believe that that territory was occupied after the 1967 war, then there are rules in the Geneva Convention related to occupation that prohibit resettling your population in occupied territory for the simple reason that it makes returning that territory incredibly difficult. And that's where we are now with Israel. Anybody who's ever been there, by the way, if you haven't been there, your image of a settlement is like a double wide on an outcrop in a desert. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about suburbs. These are suburbs of Jerusalem, and people want to live there because it's affordable, and they have a yard, and they have a playground, and they have security provided by the Israeli Defense Forces. It's inconceivable to me that the Israelis are ever going to force those people out of those communities now. They're there to stay. The question is, how do you now figure out a way to come to terms on a two-state solution where the other side is going to agree to have kind of a Swiss cheese map for their state, where there are pockets of Israeli sovereignty? I think the growing weight of perception on the Israeli right is that the Palestinians are never going to agree to that. We're never going to give it up. So let's just come to terms with reality and annex it. And we're talking about not the entire West Bank. You know, when people talk about annexation, I don't think that's what the plan would be. It's to annex what are called Area A communities under the Oslo agreements. And those are communities that are controlled by Israel in the West Bank. These are where Israelis live. And I think that the move will be to annex them, claim sovereignty over them, and then present the Palestinians with kind of a fait accompli. We're not leaving. We're not giving it up. If you want the rest of the West Bank, areas B and C, let's negotiate. But this is not part of the negotiation.
Wow. Well, the only thing I know for sure, Jeffrey, is that you and I are going to be talking for a very long time to come. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us in this new 2025 we've got.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Take care. We're going to take a break. We're going to be back with more after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I'm very pleased to welcome back Mike Sozan, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and has been studying and thinking about all things government for a very, very long time. Mike, how are you?
I'm good. I'm glad to be back on your show. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, too. Okay, the first question, is it going to be a Happy New Year, Mike? Or is it going to be a living hell?
Hopefully it's going to be happy. I always try to stay optimistic, but wow, we do have challenges ahead. And I'm looking out and the beautiful snow falling here in Washington, D.C. And again, I'm trying to feel good, get some inspiration from that beautiful snow. But yeah, I mean, today especially is a sobering day as we're on the 4th anniversary of the January 6th insurrection.
You know, I probably more than the average person have been paying attention to not only what happened on January 6th, but the fallout and the investigations and the interviews and the testimony. And still, this morning, when I reviewed some of the footage, some of the stuff that the committee had put out, I was surprised that it was more awful than I remembered. The things people did and said were more awful than I remembered. Is that because we just can't tolerate stuff like that in our memory, that we have to somehow soften it? You know, is that the kind of thing that, you know, should it be playing on a loop somewhere so we never forget?
Absolutely. I mean, what we saw that day, and we all saw it vividly on our TVs, and then we learned more and more from behind the scenes what was happening in the months and even years after it. We cannot allow this to be whitewashed. We cannot allow the facts of that terrible day to be changed. And that's what we're seeing in front of our eyes. We see that there is an attempt by partisans to whitewash the facts and to say it was just a harmless demonstration. And now huge numbers of Americans are agreeing with that. And you're right that I've gone back and looked at some of the footage, which is really tough. I mean, I worked on Capitol Hill for several years, and I know some of those spaces where the events were taking place. And I've been in the Senate and House chamber, of course, which were so desecrated. And it really is shocking what was going on. Remember, they wanted to hang Mike Pence.
Yes.
They set up a guillotine. They were mere a couple hundred feet away from Mike Pence at one point. And when I say they, I mean the rioters. And members of Congress feared for their lives. And, a Confederate flag was carried through the Capitol by one of the demonstrators. And feces were smeared everywhere. And it was just, but most importantly, what they were trying to do is literally stop the peaceful transfer of power to Joe Biden. And they had been whipped up into a frenzy by Donald Trump. And, we have to make sure that history is not retold here, and that we don't forget that day. It's not like we don't want to have people live in that day forever. But, I feel one thing I want to say, Joan, is that I feel that a lot of this is because many people feel unheard or unseen by our political system. One of the things you and I have talked about, and one of the things that my work really centers on, I think one of the answers here is we need to build a much stronger democracy, one that is truly responsive and accountable to the American people and can inspire them to reject political violence and law breaking. I think that that's one of the paths ahead. And going back to your question about what does this year ahead look like? I mean, we're going to have so many challenges with Donald Trump in the presidency, but maybe there are ways that pro-democracy Americans can really talk about a longer-term path to building a democracy that can work for everybody.
It seems to me, and I'm trying to find a way of saying this that isn't too blunt or insulting, it seems to me that we have, whether it is because of our education system or because of willful decisions, we have an incredibly uneducated public. I mean, we've always known that there were gradations here, but the fact that in the articles that I've read about, why people voted for Trump this time around, and, stuff that isn't true, why, he was so good for the economy last time he was here, or other bits of nonsense that the slightest amount of reading would dispel. I'm stunned. Forget about knowing civics, how a bill becomes a bill. I mean, just basic lack of effort to learn what's true. And I don't know where that comes from, whether it's coming from a willful rejection, whether it's coming from a poor educational system. But I'm stunned by the number of people who are Trump supporters, and I'm not saying that this is exclusive to them, but it's, I've seen interview after interview after interview of people who are breathtakingly ignorant. And I don't know how the Democratic Party fixes that, Mike.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest challenges for democracies anywhere, which is when you don't have a population that is agreeing on basic facts and is educated about the basic components of democracy and educated about the political process, things can fall apart. If that's for sure. And it goes beyond just civics education. It goes beyond basic, schooling. It also, we see that social media has really become stratified. And so a lot of Americans are in an information silo of one sort or another. We no longer as a society get our news largely from the same sources. You remember the days where people used to gather around the CBS News and watch Walter
Cronkite, yes.
Yeah, and he was a trusted news source from people across the political spectrum. And he was delivering facts that most people could agree on, 80 or 90% of people could agree on. That is very important for a democracy. And without that baseline, things become very difficult, and we do see that now. One thing I'll also say, I'm taking this as a real lesson from this election, and it's one that is not great for people like me who were really trying to educate people about the perils of authoritarianism. What we saw is that many people who did know the facts and who were willing to admit that Donald Trump presents real dangers to democracy were willing to look past it. And many of them were willing to look past it because they thought that the cost of living and inflation and their economic situation was so challenging that they were willing to take a chance on Donald Trump again. And they were willing to take a chance even on the fact that he may tear down the guardrails of our democracy. And I'm really wrestling with that, and I'm, as I know many people are, and trying to do a deep dive there and figure out what is the root of that. Why are people willing to take a chance on a slide towards authoritarianism? And maybe it just comes back to the fact that people want to get ahead. They want to achieve the American dream. They need to put food on the table. And for some reason, they didn't believe that the Democrats were giving them a viable path forward there, and they were willing to take their chances again with Trump.
So when Donald Trump very shortly after his election came out and said, oh, yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do anything about grocery prices because, once prices go up, it's really hard to bring them back down again. So I may not be able to do anything about that. So the people who voted for him because they felt that their corn checks were too expensive, are they now going, oh my gosh, I was bamboozled. I should never have believed this guy. Or is it just going to be, oh well, yeah, it is really hard. Oh, it is really hard. Yeah, he's right. I don't know.
It remains to be seen. I think that comments like that have already been catching some people by surprise. And what I predict over the next 4 years is that people are going to see that Donald Trump ultimately is not going to govern as he promised. They perhaps should have learned that lesson from the first time around. But they're going to see that he is making all sorts of decisions that are favoring his cronies, the billionaires that he's putting into his cabinet, that he's going to tear down the guardrails of our system to make it much more easy for him to ram through an agenda that's going to hurt people ultimately, that's going to make people less safe and less prosperous, and that he's in it for himself. Right now, I think people are still giving him the benefit of the doubt. He's got actually an okay approval rating, but I would guess that that's going to change, and it's also going to take an active it's going to take an active Democratic Party or any Americans who want to work on the side of pointing this out on a daily basis, making clear that Americans understand that Donald Trump is not going to be working on their behalf at every step. Most of the time, he's going to be making decisions that are going to hurt them. And I think that, fast forward 4 years from now, I'm guessing that there's going to be a very negative view about him and what he tried to do to. How
about 2 years from now? Can we move that up 2 years from now for the midterm elections?
It could be. I mean, historically, the trends show that Democrats should take at least the House back, and so you could see this as a 2-year quote unquote honeymoon period for Trump, and we'll see.
We'll see. I'm speaking to Mike Sozan for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. We are going to continue this discussion right after a break.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I am joined by Mike Sozan, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and we have been talking about how this new Trump administration is going to unfold. Mike, Bernie Sanders did something. Well, he's the first one I've heard who's actually taken action, but I've read that other Democrats are thinking of doing this, taking Trump's campaign promises and turning them into legislation. Bernie Sanders either has written or is about to write, according to him, a bill that would cap credit card interest rates at 10% based on a campaign promise Donald Trump made where he talked about bringing these rates down because they were too expensive. I think that is a win-win strategy. Either he follows up on his promise and follows through, which is a win for people, or he shows his colors that those were all false statements designed just to get votes, and Democrats have more ammunition for the midterm elections. What are your thoughts on this potential effort by Dems to write legislation based on Trump campaign promises?
I like this effort. I think it is creative. I think it will help illustrate ultimately where Trump stands. You said it right. Either Trump and the Republicans can agree to go along with it, or they can state their reasons why they disagree, and it'll show the American people whose side they're on. Now, of course, for these first 2 years at least, Republicans control the Senate and the House, so the ability for any Democrat to try to move legislation ahead and force a vote is going to be very limited. So
unless they pitch it as, we want to work with you, President Trump. You said you wanted this, so here it is. And let's do it in a bipartisan way. And, we're going to help you put parts of your agenda in place. Would that back Trump into some kind of corner?
I think it could, and I think that progressives and Democrats are going to be wrestling with exactly this sort of thing. On the one hand, a lot of Democrats say they do not want to work with Trump, but they want to block his agenda, which they think is going to be harmful to Americans. They want to score political points against Trump whenever they can. They don't want to give him victories. But I think a lot of Democrats, after they saw the results of this election, in which Donald Trump did carry the popular vote, and they've been listening to their constituents, especially in some of the swing districts. Many Democrats are open to working with Trump on issues where there can be some agreement, like capping credit card fees, for example. That might be one. And so I think it's going to be interesting how it plays out over the coming months to see where the Democratic Party stands on this issue of trying to maybe cobble together some things. Because, as you just said, I mean, if the Democrats want to present this idea to the Republicans, it would need to be probably part of a larger negotiation, because Republicans aren't just going to say yes to whatever the Democrats want to bring up. So I think this is going to be part of the give and take. It's going to take several months to play out to see exactly where Democrats decide to go on this, and whether Donald Trump is willing or able to work with the Democrats on doing some bipartisan things.
I don't know, Mike, if there has been any research into this yet, if you have any data. Why did so many millions of registered Democrats not vote? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, we're starting to get some insight into it, and it just seems that several million people who had voted for Joe Biden this time around were not inspired enough to vote for Kamala Harris. They didn't necessarily vote for Donald Trump, but they just decided not to vote. I mean, originally I was wondering whether when Trump won, it would be because he got tons of new voters to turn out, or he converted a ton of voters. And he did convert some voters, and he did bring out maybe some new ones, but it wasn't this massive new sweep. It was a lot of it is because people stayed home who had voted for Joe Biden. And we got to really continue to do a deep dive into why that is. It would appear that some of it is based on inflation and the cost of living, but there's also something else that I'm tapping into and think played a part in this. You know, it relates to what we've talked about before and what I just brought up a few minutes ago. People are very angry at the system, Joan. People don't feel that democracy is working for them. And they are in a phase where they keep wanting to elect outsiders, and they want to elect people who are willing to really tackle the broken democracy. And what happened in this last election is that Harris ended up being seen as the defender of the status quo. Remember, she kept saying we got to protect our democracy against Donald Trump. Heck, you know, I was saying that too. But what we learned is to a lot of Americans' ears, that meant protecting the broken system as it is right now. And Donald Trump was able to brilliantly position himself again as the outsider who is going to get control of government waste, fraud, and abuse and make the government work on behalf of people. And he was going to nominate outsiders. And he was able to seize that mantle of the person who was angry about the system that's not working for people. And I think candidates are going to really have to study that. We all are, because Donald Trump really tapped into that. And that's why I think a lot of people stayed home, because they weren't necessarily buying his vision, but they also saw Harris as a defender of the status quo, of a system that's not working.
There was some reporting over the holidays that, and I don't know if this was WAPO or if this was Politico, that while he certainly hasn't said anything to this effect publicly, that privately Joe Biden does believe that he could have beat Donald Trump. The person who I saw who reported that framed it as, you know, Joe Biden is delusional. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, he certainly wasn't an outsider, if that's what they were looking for.
Right. I think that Biden also would have lost the election. I think that the data showed that before he decided to withdraw, he was on a very perilous downward spiral. And I just don't think he could have won the election. I think that some of these factors that you and I are discussing about the unpopular incumbent administration that wasn't meeting the needs of the American people, I think that Biden would have succumbed to the same fate. I know that Biden continues to believe that he was uniquely positioned, again, to be the sort of person who could beat Trump, but I just don't see it. I always understand that racism and misogyny play a big part in politics, as they do, sadly, a big part in just our society. And I think that Harris was probably victim of that, which is a really sad fact. But ultimately, I think that she was part of this incumbent administration, and that's why she lost in part. And Biden, of course, was the incumbent. And I'll say one other thing: I don't think she did herself any favors during the campaign. You remember she was asked a very important question, which was, Vice President Harris, what would you do differently, if anything, from what President Biden has done as president? And she said, well, I can't really think of anything. And I understand why she wanted to be loyal to him. But
well, she was still the vice president. I mean, talk about putting somebody in an awkward situation.
It was very, very awkward, of course. But I think there could have been some graceful ways that she could have explained how she might have prioritized things differently. And I think to a lot of voters' ears, that just rang again as a defender of the status quo.
Well, if you are correct, and what you're saying makes a lot of sense, that part of what swept Trump into office was this idea that government's not working, so let's get non-government people. We're not going to put in a vice president or a senator or a congressperson. We're going to put in somebody who's an outsider. What does that say about where we will be when it comes to the 2028 election? I mean, do you think that the person who's going to be leading the Democratic charge will be somebody whose name we're not familiar with right now because they're an outsider? I mean, the only Democrat that I can think of who sort of has even a semi-outsider persona is John Fetterman. Because, I mean, he's always, he's breaking the traditions and he's wearing his hoodies and his shorts and, if he screams blue collar wherever he goes. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Is there somebody new who is going to emerge, or do you think somebody whose name we already know is capable of being this outsider?
Well, I wish my crystal ball was a better functioning thing.
Shine it up. I know. Breathe some steam on it and wipe it with. I've been trying
to get it back into functioning order. And man, the last few years have been challenging for the crystal ball. But yeah, I think that it could be an outsider who's not even part of politics, is not an elected official. But I also think it very well could be the sort of figure like Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who does have this sort of outsider visual image and rhetoric. I also think it could be somebody like Governor Gavin Newsom of California, or Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, if they really talk about how they want to remake democracy. If they're willing to take on some of the big issues like the Electoral College or gerrymandering or getting rid of big money in politics or taking real steps to reduce corruption, more importantly, telling a vivid narrative about how corporations and billionaires and wealthy special interests have hijacked the system. I think even a sitting governor can do that, especially if they can show some proof points of what they've tried to do about it. I think that people need to hear that narrative and need to see a bad guy or bad guys that are being taken on by the candidate. That's something that I think could come from outside elected officials, somebody we might not even know about right now, or it could come from the current crop. But I think they've got to start thinking about that, about framing issues in that way, or else they are going to be seen in 2028 as defenders of a system that's just not working for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. It's going to be an interesting few years. And my fear is, we think because we lived through a Trump presidency once before that some people feel like, we know what's coming and we know how to brace for it. But I think he's wised up a lot, and I think it's going to, at least for the first 2 years where he has a Republican Senate and a Republican House, I think potentially it could be worse than we've experienced before. But you know what? Maybe that's what we need to be able to win in the midterms. I don't know. My crystal ball is not working either.
Exactly, and I think it's going to be challenging, and I think a lot of the guardrails are going to be coming off, and he's going to implement the Project 2025 plan, and he's going to go after political enemies. But I think ultimately, though, people are going to see that he's not on the side of everyday Americans. We'll see how that plays out. There needs to be an effective messaging machine around it. There also needs to be a responsible media. There needs to be good reporting and discussion from people like you who can really get at the facts and really let people know what's going on. And we have to see whether then as a country, as communities, with our social compact together, whether we can kind of rise up against authoritarianism and whether we can build a strong democracy together.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Mike Sozan is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thank you, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Always
We're going to take a break for news, and we're going to be back with Spencer Critchley right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Spencer Critchley is the author of the book Patriots of Two Nations. If you haven't had a chance to peruse it, it'll give you a lot of insight into how the Trump supporter is different from you and me. He also does a podcast called Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. He is currently writing a new political book that he is releasing on his Dastardly Cleverness website, one chapter at a time. And we have designated that as our book club book for the year 2025, that we will discuss chapter after chapter. Spencer, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Joan.
It is great to hear your voice again. I went to the dastardlycleverness.com website, and I started listening to Chapter 4. And for those of you who haven't gotten to Chapter 4, I did persevere, but I was a little gobsmacked by learning that I'm a lot like Karl Marx.
Really?
If you do recall the beginning of Chapter 4, Spencer?
Well, let me see. I'm looking it up right now here.
We need to talk about Marx, Liberal Backbone, Chapter 4. And you start off by saying that those of us who consider ourselves liberal and progressive maybe have more in common with Karl Marx than we would realize?
Well, yes and no.
Thank you for the no on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me be clear. I'm presenting in these early chapters the roots of what's now called the woke left. And a lot of those roots take you back to Karl Marx. And one of the main themes of the book is going to be that I believe there's been a lot of confusion among liberals as to just how they feel about Marx. And because of that confusion, liberals leave themselves open to this charge that either they're actually Marxists or they don't know what they stand for. Mm-hmm. And there are issues that Marx raised that liberals definitely are very concerned about. I mean, at his time, capitalism was awful. The way it treated working people was just nightmarishly bad in the factories and slums of England in particular, where he spent much of his life. And liberals share those concerns that workers should not be treated that way. Nobody should be treated that way. And yet there are fundamental incompatibilities between Marxist thought and liberal thought that I think liberals need to be clear about. And a lot of Marx's ideas survive in the current woke left. And as I say, it's not accurate to just call woke people Marxists, but Marx definitely is a major influence. And I think liberals need to understand that you can be deeply concerned about social justice and all the issues that you might think you have in common with Karl Marx, but you need to understand you're not a Marxist if you're a liberal, and you need to understand why. So we begin in Chapter 4 to establish a shared understanding of just what Marx stood for in summary.
That's a good place for us to start. Talk about that. Talk about Karl Marx and his writing and how his thoughts came to be.
Well, let's see. The problem is that the one reason why many people are not very familiar with what Marx actually said is he's very hard to read. He's not as bad as some. There are philosophers who are harder to read, but you really have to, put in a lot of effort to truly understand what he's saying. So I'll do my best to summarize some of the key points. And I think at the center of his thought is his theory of history. And he believed he had actually discovered a science of history. He thought this wasn't just a theory. He thought he had proven that this is how history works. And it was so reliable, his science of history, that he could predict what was going to happen. Not exactly when, but he thought it was going to happen soon, which was global communist revolution. And at the core of what he thought of as science of history was his belief that the natural state of human beings was communal, what would later be called primitive communism. And a lot of liberals think this is true, too.
And when you say that our natural state is communal, are you talking about back in the days where we all lived in the same cave kind of communal?
We were all hunter-gatherer society before what's now called civilization. So he believed that people lived in this kind of a Garden of Eden state where everybody worked together. They produced only as much as they needed, and they shared it with each other. They took satisfaction in their work. They had close family and tribal connections. And there was no war because people in that state have no reason to have any conflict with each other. Now, again, this is not actually borne out by science.
Yeah, because what if our cave is better than your cave? You might want to take over our cave.
Now, this remains a popular belief, including among many liberals. You'll hear lots of people saying, we were better off as hunter-gatherers and before we had all this civilization, and people cooperated peacefully, and many people think that society was matriarchal back then and it was peaceful and cooperative and all that stuff. And now there were societies that were more or less like that, but it's not true that that's the actual single natural state of humanity before civilization. It's an appealing myth. It's very much like the story of the Garden of Eden, but there is no scientific basis that that's the one original state of human society. However, a lot of people did think that at Marx's time, in large part because of European encounters with indigenous people in the Americas and in Australia and the South Seas and elsewhere. And they thought that, for example, the Iroquois in America were living in the original state of nature, this cooperative state that I was just describing. And Europeans really were attracted to this, and they romanticized it a great deal. And Marx thought it was true, too. And Marx's theory was that what ruined everything was the invention of private property. What happened was as tools got better, these hunter-gatherers were able to take up farming and produce more than they needed. And when that happened, when there was a surplus, like extra food or extra whatever, some people claimed, well, that's now my private property. And that created social classes, a hierarchy of classes. And people who owned property became the upper class. And this came to characterize all of subsequent history, which would be driven by the struggle between classes of property owners versus workers, basically. And some of this language might sound familiar, but, class struggle, you'll hear Marxists talk about class struggle a lot. And Marx believed that economic class struggle was the driving force of history and explained everything that had happened throughout history, essentially. And what happened around about the time of the Enlightenment and the rise of science was the rise of industrialization, greatly intensified this process and created industrial capitalism. And he believed that increased the intensity of class struggle and the suffering and exploitation of working people to such an extent that capitalism would inevitably fall. It would sow the seeds of its own destruction by making workers ever more miserable until they finally rose up. And when they rose up in revolution, it would start in the industrialized countries, but it would spread all over the world. There'd be a global revolution which would destroy social classes, destroy private property, as the workers became conscious of themselves as people who should naturally be living in a communistic state of communal cooperation and return to that state, free of private property, free, therefore, of any reason to have any conflict. Marx believed once there was no more private property, there'd be no more classes, there'd be no more conflict, therefore there'd be no more war, there'd be no more need for separate nations. The entire world would go back to its natural state, in this case as a global commune, which would be peaceful and prosperous and cooperative. There wouldn't even be any need for politics because there'd be no more need for political conflict. And so governments would shrink to nearly nothing, and they would just be essentially administrative bureaucrats just managing systems. And this would essentially be the dawn of this would be the fruition of history, essentially. It would be the end of history and the beginning of a new age, with a new form of humanity restored to its original communal state, but with the benefits of industrial wealth shared equally. So that's kind of Marx in a nutshell. Now,
well, it sounds like one of those ideas that on paper sounds very reasonable and believable, but like one of those little experiments that then when you actually put it to the test, it falls apart, because if Karl Marx's beliefs were true, then, communism would by now be pervasive across the globe.
Yes.
And yet, when the Soviet Union was at its communist height, it seems to me that what became known was that, there is not everybody is willing to do their 8-hour shift for the common good. If there's no getting ahead, if there's no buying stock, owning a piece of the factory or the farm, that people weren't all so motivated to do things because it was for the common good.
Right. And this is a key flaw in Marxism, in my view. I think it's probably the fundamental flaw is his theory of what we might call human nature. He wouldn't use that term, but let's, for simplicity, call it human nature, was just wrong. And, to the extent we can know anything is wrong, that theory of human nature is wrong. People are motivated by the urge to cooperate with each other, but they're also motivated to prey on each other and steal from each other and exploit each other and even, attack each other and even be sadistic, just for the sheer joy of being sadistic. All of those drives appear to be natural in human nature, and you find them going back as far as you want through history and prehistory, and you find them in evolutionary history. You find the great apes behave this way as well. There's always a big ape who takes over the troop of apes, and there's a lot of violence. Chimpanzees can be terribly violent to each other. So it just seems to be wrong. And what happens with Marxism when you try to put it into practice is you keep discovering that this view of human nature just is wrong. Human beings refuse to perform according to the theory. And what happens in practice, and has happened every time somebody's tried to establish a Marxist state, is they discover that these pesky human beings keep refusing to be liberated into communism the way they're supposed to be, and they keep behaving in self-centered ways, along with generous and cooperative ways, but people still hang on to their self-interest, and they'll look for ways to pursue their own advantage or the advantage of their family. Some of them will be criminals, even though crime should have disappeared with the disappearance of private property. And so you find that in order to maintain this communist consensus in the society, you end up having to use coercion and, in the end, violence to force people to behave the way your theory tells you they should want to behave. And that happens again and again, and has happened. Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia, North Korea, everywhere anybody has tried this, it has produced similar results. And instead of this communal utopia with no need for a government, you end up with an extremely repressive government just barely holding all of this stuff together, and a truly miserable population unless they've been brainwashed, because propaganda ends up becoming necessary, too, to convince people they're actually happy with the state of affairs. And you have to clamp down on free speech to prevent people from saying anything that's considered counter-revolutionary. Now, there are still Marxists in the world who would disagree with everything I just said, and they'll say that every example I pointed to was not true Marxism, and it had been corrupted in some way and or sabotaged by capitalist countries led by the United States. I just don't think that they can, support that argument with evidence. And by now, the evidence is overwhelming that Marxism fails in practice. Also, it ends up producing, I argue that the logic of it is inherently repressive. It's not a failure of Marxism when it becomes repressive. It's required by this theory of human nature because people are never going to behave in that ideal fashion.
Mm-hmm. It's not a bug. It's a feature of the program.
Well, he didn't want it to be this way. He thought he was creating the perfect society, the perfect natural sort of good society. But he was just, I believe, fundamentally wrong. And in order to try to get people to conform to the theory, you have to coerce them. Or else you have to admit the theory is wrong. And Marxists really don't want to admit the theory is wrong.
Spencer, I've enjoyed talking about this, but I have dragged us away from Chapter 4 of your book. So,
this is
background. Yes, you're right.
Yep.
You're right. Yep. You can't have too much background and too much history. I love going off on these kinds of tangents. So tell me again, though, how the ideas of Karl Marx are related to liberalism or being woke.
Yeah, well, and I'm working on more of that right now in the current chapter, which is Chapter 6, which I hope to have up in the next day or two. So Marx really did not like liberalism, and he thought liberalism was just at best a half measure, and at worst it was just perpetuating oppression. Because he believed that the only solution would be in the destruction of the current society, because oppression was built into our society, because so long as private property and social classes based on private property existed, there would continue to be exploitation and oppression and suffering and war. And the only way to bring that to an end was to eliminate private property and essentially destroy the existing system and build the new one. And that belief continues to the present day. In this book, I'm tracing the history to the current woke left and showing that some of these core beliefs persist to today. And that includes the belief that you can't have liberalism where you just try to reform the current system, essentially. You have to actually dismantle the current system and replace it. And liberals just can't sign up for that. And not because they want to support the parts of our current system that are unjust. This is where there's overlap, that liberals agree that there is and has long been injustice in society, often terrible injustice like slavery or Jim Crow or the inability of women to vote or the cultural or actual genocide of Native Americans. I mean, you can point to lots of examples. But liberals, if they are liberals, they can't sign up for dismantling liberal democracy because from the liberal point of view, as flawed as it is, this is the best humanity has ever done, and it keeps getting better. And if we tear it down, it's not going to be an improvement. And when that has been tried, the results have been far, far worse.
Which I agree with that. And I also think that there's a danger, even if we had a system that needed to be torn down, I think that there's a real danger that once you tear something down, something you might not expect will jump in to fill that vacuum. It seems by adjusting rather than tearing down, you can have maybe the best of both worlds, tweaking and not losing what the good parts are.
And that more or less is the liberal argument, and it varies how much change you embrace sort of defines where you are on the left-right spectrum. So a conservative liberal, which would be what we call a traditional conservative, is somebody who believes in liberalism, as in liberal democracy, but they have conservative values. So if you're at the conservative end of liberalism, you're slow to change, and you argue like one of the most influential conservatives, Edmund Burke, argued in the 19th century, that traditions are there for a reason, and often you don't understand the value embodied in traditional ways of doing things, so you should be slow to tear them down, because you'll probably discover that there was a lot more there than you understood when you just tore them down, not being clear on what was going to replace them. Now, at the left end of the liberal spectrum, you're much more willing to embrace change. So you're a progressive, and meaning you're much more comfortable changing things and trying experiments. But nowhere on that liberal spectrum do you think the whole system of liberalism should be torn down. Because, as I say, although you recognize the often deep imperfections in society, you also believe that this is the best humanity has ever done, and it's built into it is constant improvement, as I believe we have seen throughout the history of liberalism for the past few hundred years. But yeah, that's essentially the issue there, as you just described. And it is, in my view, another fundamental flaw of Marxism. I'm not the only person who thinks this. Marx never actually described how any of this would work. He didn't think he needed to specify any details for how to run the government of a Marxist country, because he believed the forces of history were going to cause it all to collapse, everything we had currently to collapse. And people would naturally establish a global commune in which government would essentially not be necessary. So there was no need to describe how to make any of this work. And so what actually ends up happening in practice, though, is people who have torn down the existing system in Russia or China or elsewhere have discovered that, no, you don't get the communist, utopia organically and spontaneously, and there is no program that describes how you can make all of this work, at least in a way that is humane. And that becomes another, really deep inherent flaw in Marxist thought, in my view.
You said a few minutes ago, you referred to I believe what you said was the woke left. Some would argue that was redundant. Tell me why you don't think it is.
Oh, no, and this is a big political problem that liberals face right now, the left in general faces right now, because as we all see, much of the country has come to believe the right-wing line that the entire Democratic Party has been taken over by the woke, for example. And the reason Democrats are losing elections is because they're so extremely woke. Well, that's not true, but I argue that liberals make it look like it's true, or they make it look like it might be believable by being unclear on what the difference is between the woke left and the liberal left. And not being able to clearly say, no, we in the Democratic Party, at least, by far the majority of the Democratic Party, are not the woke left. And we actually reject this perspective on things because we deeply believe in liberalism, and here's what liberalism is. So that is a big problem. And a lot of liberals, I believe, have been really timid or just confused about making those kinds of distinctions. Because
I think I mentioned this to you once before, that shortly after I started doing this show, one of my listeners texted in, and it's difficult to read emotion with a text, but I always assumed there was sort of a snarky, disgruntled edge. and I was told, you're not progressive, you're liberal. And I thought to myself, I can live with that. If you meant to insult me, you did not succeed.
This gets to the heart of this issue. Most people, I believe, on the left assume there's only one progressive left, and they assume that it's more or less woke. So if you're left, you're going to be more and more woke. Now, the thing is, you can be a very progressive liberal. Like I would say Bernie Sanders, for example, is a very progressive liberal. And I don't think he would be, I don't know if he'd be comfortable saying this for himself, but I don't think he's woke in the same sense. Clearly he is socialist to some degree, but that's not the same as being a Marxist.
His socialism and his progressive attitudes and speeches, he, to me, is touched by pragmatism, which not all progressives that I interact with and read about, sometimes that bit of pragmatism seems to be lost. So I agree with you. You know, he's progressive, but he's not a progressive who just wants to fight for something because, you know, because it's the right thing to do. He wants to fight for something in a way that achieves the goal.
Right. And that word pragmatism is also very important philosophically. A characteristic of this woke left tradition going back to Marx. Again, I'm not saying that woke left is identical with Marxism, but there's a heavy influence from Marx. Another key characteristic is the preference of theory over reality, in my view. So,
oh, my God. Hang on a second, Spencer. I've just taken us halfway through a commercial break, and I apologize to you.
Dear.
And I apologize to Paul Shabari back at the studio. I just want to get so Spencer Critchley and I will be right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
My guest is Spencer Critchley. He is releasing a new book, chapter by chapter, as he writes it. His first book, Patriots of Two Nations, can give you a real great insight into why we are seemingly two different peoples living in this country right now. And the new book is called The Liberal Backbone. We've been talking about, we started with Chapter 4, but I kind of slid a little bit into Chapter 5 because the two chapters have a lot to do about Karl Marx and a lot to do about liberal and progressive and wokeness. I promise to pay better attention to the clock so as not to exclaim mightily in the middle of a conversation that we have to get to a break. Spencer, sorry for the rude interruption.
No problem. Well, Marxists would probably argue we were just proving their point that we're all slaves to capitalism.
Yes, I interrupted us, yes, so we could get our capitalist ads and capitalist ads in.
And serve our true masters. I wanted to not forget that word pragmatism you just used, because I think that's also a key concept, and it's another way to understand all this without having to wade through, volumes and volumes of complex ideology. So another reason that I believe intolerance is actually built into the logic of Marxism is that it's part of a long tradition of thinking based on the belief that you found a higher source of knowledge, and this is coming up in Chapter 6, actually. And if you believe you have access to a higher source of knowledge, which in one form or another just basically tells you the truth about reality, why would you tolerate disagreement? Because anybody who disagrees with that can at best be mistaken, and they may just be dangerous because you've found the truth, and so anybody who contradicts it is either spreading errors or lies, and sometimes those can be dangerous lies, and that tendency in Chapter 6, I'm going to trace it back to Plato, who believed that his theory of forms was the source of higher knowledge. And he believed that the ideal republic would be a dictatorship of philosophers who had access to that higher knowledge, and that would actually liberate people from their state of delusion and error. And that's how he thought of liberation. Well, that tendency has continued throughout history, descended from Plato, and then there's a religious version of it that comes from religions.
I was going to say that's a similar argument to I hear from the white Christian nationalists. And I remember, I think this has now been 2 or 3 years ago, Mike Flynn was doing an interview, and he was like, well, why wouldn't we be a Christian nation? Not even arguing for it, but questioning how anybody could possibly be opposed to that.
Oh, exactly, because the truth comes from God, and we know what that truth is. It's in the Christian Bible.
From God, through me to you.
Yeah,
That's my favorite part.
Why would you not do that? And so the same argument is made by Islamic fundamentalists and by fundamentalists of every religion that's based on revealed truth like this. And tolerating dissent is not just a mistake, but it's actually sinful, because you're working against God if you let people argue with God, essentially. So there's a secular version of that that's often can be traced back to Plato, and in this case, it's a secular theory that you've come up with that you're convinced is right, and I would say Marx is very much in that tradition. He believed, as I said at the beginning, he had discovered the science of history and that it was infallible. And so when he said a global communist revolution was coming, he didn't think that was a matter of opinion. It was inevitable, and he used words like that. It was just coming. He said it almost really doesn't matter what I say or what anybody does. It's coming. And he thought it was coming soon when he and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Obviously, it wasn't. But you mentioned pragmatism. So that tradition of believing you found this theory that explains everything continues throughout Western philosophy, from Plato through a European tradition known as analytical philosophy, and before that, metaphysics, which all tends to be based on you found the logic of reality. You found the theory that explains it. And that is far more important than just sort of the messy day-to-day reality of just experience that is so changeable, and it's so complicated, and you want to find the theory that's behind it all that explains everything. Well, there's a parallel tradition, especially since about Enlightenment days, that liberalism is a part of, which is much more based on the assumption that we actually can't have that kind of knowledge. I mean, you're free to believe you have that knowledge under liberalism. You can be a devoutly religious person, for example, if you want, or you can believe intensely in whatever your secular theory is. But liberalism in general says we're not going to declare what the source of ultimate truth and morality is. We're going to accept that we can't be sure, and we're going to live in a world where we have to live with doubt and uncertainty and disagreement. And we're going to make the best of living in that world in ways that respect people's individual human rights and spare them from coercion and violence. And that's essentially the liberal attitude, which is inherently, especially as liberalism has evolved, pragmatic, where we say, okay, you can be Catholic, you can be Muslim, you can be an atheist, you can be socialist, you can be an arch capitalist, you can be all those things, as long as you obey the basic ground rules of no violence, and respecting elections and that sort of thing. You can be part of this society, and we're not going to declare that these people are right and these people are wrong. We're just going to let everybody believe what they believe, as long as we all agree to these basic ground rules of liberalism, and live together peacefully, and in this way cooperatively, but not through a consensus because we all agree that communism is the answer or something else is the answer, but because we all agree not to coerce each other and not to be violent towards each other, and instead to respect each other's individual rights. So pragmatism is actually central to the liberal outlook. Part of the problem is pragmatism is not particularly inspiring, right? If you have
and a lot of
religious
quote-unquote progressives
it can be much more inspiring.
Who've gotten too pragmatic get kicked out of the progressive club.
Yeah,
it's a fine line.
Because you violate the dogma. And this is a problem, again, with this tradition that I'm talking about that I ultimately trace back to Plato, but Marx is one of the really, really central figures of, is that it tends easily towards dogmatism and intolerance because it's based on the assumption we've got the theory. We know how this all works. And if you disagree with that theory, by definition, you're at least mistaken, but you may very well be dangerous. And the current version of that theory is not Marxism. It remains influenced by Marxism, but it's a theory of structural oppression that replaces Marx's view of private property. It replaces private property just with power. And it argues that everything about our society, including our own identities, including all our values, including the economic system, including the way the media works, everything serves the interests of power. And liberal freedom is an illusion that just keeps this propped up. And the only true freedom is to learn this theory so that you can deconstruct these structures of power essentially continuously. So in every interaction you have, you would be, anytime anybody says anything potentially, you would be critiquing it and, another piece of jargon is problematizing it by identifying how power is actually working in this interaction. And only by doing that can you achieve liberation. And ultimately, you can't argue with that position because, like any theory of everything, it can't be contradicted. It can't be falsified, as scientists say, because there's nothing you can say that the theory won't explain. So no matter what you say to criticize it, you're only saying that because you are either a dupe, you've been brainwashed by power, or you're an oppressor who's actually acting in the interests of power. And so any theory like that is very much like a fundamentalist religion, or a conspiracy theory is similar too. It's impossible to falsify it because the answer to everything is to restate the basic premise of the theory. Just like you were saying, well, I know that's true because it's in the Bible. Well, you can't argue with that. That's the answer to everything ultimately. And similarly, Marxists would say, well, no, that's wrong because as Marx said, et cetera, et cetera. And the current version of that is you just don't understand how structural oppression works. And, you're saying that because either you're speaking from the position of white identity or from an oppressed identity, and you are just unaware so far of how that determines the way you think. And as I say, that can't be falsified. It appears to explain everything. And if you do try to argue with it, ultimately you'll have to be at least corrected, but quite likely ostracized, because ultimately what you're doing is serving power and furthering oppression by continuing to argue that way.
Mm-hmm. And earlier, when we were talking about your first book, I was questioning why certain people believe a bunch of things that are absurd, and you pointed out that because you're part of that tribe, and if you disbelieve one of those things, you are no longer a part of that tribe. So it's sort of an all or nothing kind of embrace.
Yeah. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the stuff that you come across in what's known as theory now, a longer name for it might be postmodern critical theory, but it's often called theory for short. A lot of the insights are pretty good. Like the idea that oppression is often structural, that's very often true. I mean, especially in the past, it was obviously true. I mean, black people couldn't get home loans, they couldn't vote, theoretically they were free, but under Jim Crow, they were absolutely not free. And they were suffering from structural oppression. Women suffered from structural oppression. They couldn't, open a bank account.
That doesn't have to be past tense. Women still
and it continues,
suffer.
right? Women still suffer from all of the, lots of, every disadvantaged group suffers from structural oppression to this day. People build structures that end up oppressing other people. So a lot of this stuff is true. It's just that it doesn't explain everything, and the solution that's offered ends up not solving the problem, and in fact, in my view, replaces one form of unfreedom with another form of unfreedom that's worse. Because under liberalism, as I say, you have the tools to continuously challenge and improve all of this, but what happens under these various theories that I'm describing is that the fundamental assumptions are intolerant of disagreement. And so in the name of liberation, you end up imposing a new form of domination. where you are required basically to agree with this theory. And that is, I don't believe that's ultimately true freedom. And it ends up also perpetuating errors because people tend to assume they found the solution because theoretically this must be the solution. If we remove this source of structural oppression, we should see this behavior. But when they don't, it's very difficult to correct and adjust because you can't challenge the premises of the theory.
I want to ask you a little bit more about this, but we are going to take a real quick break. Spencer Critchley and I will be right back after this.
Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now on WCPT 820.
Spencer Critchley is releasing his new book, The Liberal Backbone, chapter by chapter, on his website for his podcast. The website is dastardlycleverness.com. We have been talking about chapters 4 and 5, and we got a little preview of chapter 6, where we're talking about, well, we started talking about Karl Marx, we were talking about Plato, and Spencer, you were talking about these some systems that don't tolerate any kind of challenge or disagreement. And I started thinking to myself, well, what does challenge? What does accept challenge and what does accept disagreement? Doesn't that go against the very idea of either you're liberal or you're communist or you're woke? And, oh, no, I want to challenge you. Well, then you're not liberal or woke or any of these other definitions that I'm using for myself. Is there a format where challenge is welcome, disagreement is welcomed?
Yeah, that's liberalism. And now liberalism is not perfect. And, in the book, I'll be identifying its flaws. But as I say, I believe it's the best we've ever come up with. And it is founded on the idea that we must protect disagreement. And this is one of the greatest arguments for liberalism, but it is also its greatest political vulnerability because liberalism invites attack on itself, and it even provides you with the tools to attack it. Because liberalism is founded on scientific reason, which is essentially skeptical, and science argues that nothing can be known with absolute certainty, and everything is subject to revision, and we must always think critically based on evidence and logic. And liberalism has a lot in common with that, partly as a matter of just a basic value that's assumed to be good, which is that people should be free to think whatever they want to think to the greatest extent possible and say whatever they want to say to the greatest extent possible, just because ultimately you just have to decide you like that idea of freedom. You can't prove it's the best one, but many people would say they like that idea of freedom. But also from the point of view of progress, many ideas that turn out to be extremely valuable to society as a whole start out seeming crazy. Right? And, like women should vote. Are you nuts? There are many, many examples of this. And so from the point of view of making progress, you also want to protect the greatest possible range of opinions. So those are fundamental liberal values. But again, those mean that in a liberal society, you're welcome to be a communist or even a Nazi or all kinds of things, as long as you don't actually start, attacking other people or behaving in ways that violate the fundamental values and agreements of liberalism. You are free to believe all of this stuff, and you're free to organize and convince other people to join you. And we're seeing what can happen right now, where a whole bunch of anti-liberal people have come together and elected a deeply anti-liberal, authoritarian, and corrupt president for the second time. And we see this happening in liberal democracies around the world, where people are using the tools of liberalism, including, the free press and elections and free expression, to tear liberalism down.
After this Kamala Harris election loss, I read a number of astute people writing things like, sort of the antithesis of what you're saying, that we have to ignore these voices that are anything but pragmatic. We have to be pragmatic. We have to do and say and believe whatever it takes to win. And these voices of disagreement who want other points of view considered, will only win if we start to ignore those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is the challenge that liberals face, is welcoming maximum diversity and yet somehow forming a unified political front. And that, those two things are very hard to pull off. Other parties do that by being united around a religion or united around an ideology, whether it's on the left or right. And that unifies everybody because they believe they found the answer. But liberalism says basically we don't know what the answer is. We're doing our best. This is the pragmatic part. And we just know that we're going to adhere to nonviolence and negotiation and individual freedom and equality. And it's hard to inspire people to unify behind that. However, I think it's crucially important because that's the way humans behave. They need to feel united. Now, the thing is, I actually think, and I've argued this for a long time in my work in democratic politics and with clients as well, liberalism and liberal democracy are inspiring. It's just that liberals have become so stuck in their heads, they've lost sight of that, and they've lost the ability to talk about it. But you can go back just a few decades to people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or just the spirit in the country as a whole coming out of the Depression, during World War II, after World War II, when people spoke about freedom and equality, it had a kind of quasi-religious fervor. Some people describe this as civic religion, where it wasn't religious, obviously, but people felt how deeply inspiring it is to build a country on the idea that everyone is created equal. Well, now we recognize that that's only started to become true recently in our history, but the idea is deeply inspiring. And I think that is really the key to unifying a movement that also remains diverse, so that you continue to have a liberalism that can include a Bernie Sanders-style progressive way over on the left and somebody else who's a very conservative sort of traditional values or libertarian conservative on the right. And they can all be, everybody in between can be inspired by these core values. That the fact that we disagree is part of what's inspiring, because each of us is free, each of us is equal, and we all agree that we're going to defend that. And as I say, I've always found that deeply inspiring, and I think everybody can find that inspiring again. But liberals, especially liberals on the left, are going to have to rediscover how to talk about it.
Yeah. When is Chapter 6 going to officially drop? Do you know yet? Are you still working on it?
I'm hoping by Wednesday. I think that's looking pretty good.
Well, I will reach out to you. We will schedule our next meeting of the Liberal Backbone Book Club. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor, Joan, and I hope people will watch at dastardlycleverness.com or at my Spencer Critchley Substack for when it does appear, and I'd love to hear anybody's comments or suggestions.
That is going to do it for Spencer and me. Patty Vasquez, of course, is coming up. And Dwayne Kennedy is going to co-host with her again today. And Mike Sozan, who I was able to speak with a little bit earlier today, is going to join Richard Chu tomorrow. So have a great evening. Stay safe, my friends. I will see you back here tomorrow. I'm going to talk to Ray Long, find out what's going on with the Madigan trial. That should be good. Take care and good night.